Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, everywhere present and fill us all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology, joined by Pedro Gabriel, returning guest who's going to be talking about his book that he recently published, Heresy Disguised as Tradition. Welcome back, Pedro. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, great to see you. And where are you right now?
I'm at my home in Porto, Portugal.
Portugal. Awesome. Well, it's really good to have you. Honored to have you back on, and I'm excited to talk about this. Let's start with just kind of some basic terms and concepts. We hear the term heresy thrown out a lot these days, but it's somewhat unfortunate because I think that a lot of people don't really appreciate some of the nuances involved. So let's start with a precise definition of heresy.
Yeah, that's a very good point because heresy is a term that nowadays in social media it is just tossed around willy-nilly, and it has a very precise definition in the Catechism. It's an obstinate denial of the truth of the faith that one must believe because it was infallibly defined. So, correct. Nowadays, what we have is that just because the Pope or because someone seems to contradict someone's personal interpretation of what the faith is, immediately they are stamped as heretics, which is not correct. If we study the history of the councils or the history of the magisterium, we know that when the Pope or a council defines that a certain statement is heretical, it usually that comes after a very long debate in which every iota, every dot of the sentence has been discussed. So what has been condemned was that exact statement, that exact sentence. And now what we see when people use the term heretic is that they do not care about this preciseness. They don't go to the actual statement that was infallibly defined and then say, no, this denies this. No, it's like it seems like it might contradict a certain statement that might be infallible or not. It's very, very sloppy. And this is when we are mentioning heresy. But when we are accusing someone of being a heretic, it's even worse because being a heresy is a canonical crime, and it's something that needs to be proven. It needs to be obstinate. A person needs to have an opportunity to recant. There are witnesses. There's a process in place, and so nowadays, as we can see in social media, the term heresy or heretic is used merely to try to undermine someone with whom one disagrees with on matters of the Catholic faith, and that's even more serious when people with no competence or authority whatsoever just try that to undermine the magisterium of the Pope.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Now, can you give me some examples where you've seen people misuse heresy, where they've leveled these heresy accusations, but you would say that this is just inappropriate and certainly not an accurate use of the term? Do you have any examples that come to mind?
Yes, I believe that one of the most, of course, in social media, it's very easy to find those, and in those cases, it's even less accurate, less precise. But I think that one that stood out to me was the correctio filialis. And I know that the authors try to say that, oh, we don't believe that the Pope is actually saying this, but it can be interpreted in this way. But in a real sense, people were using the correctio filialis to accuse the Pope of heresy. And in my previous book, The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, I dedicate a chapter to misunderstandings of this document. And what we can see is that none of the sentences, none of the heretical statements that the Correctio Filialis allegedly corrects, none can be found in Amoris Laetitia. All of them contradict any part of Amoris Laetitia or the manifest mind and will of the Pope. So, at best, it was an exercise of debunking straw men. At worst, well, if the Pope can be said that, oh, the Pope is not proclaiming heresy, but it can be interpreted in a radical sense, well, the Correctio Filialis might not directly say that the Pope was being a heretic, but it can be interpreted in a way that causes scandal because people are going to say that the Pope is a heretic because of that. That's, for me, the most egregious case at this moment.
Yeah. Do you think that this is also something that you've seen with the most recent controversy in the church with Fiducia Supplicans? Have you seen
Oh,
people throw out the
yes.
heresy accusation there?
Oh yes, absolutely. There is absolutely no statement in the church that says that sinners cannot be blessed.
Hmm.
So good for us because all of us are sinners and all of us need the blessing of the Pope. And people were just tossing the term. Like Fiducia Supplicans is heretical, the Pope is being a heretic, Cardinal Fernandez is being a heretic. Well, but no one took the time to say, okay, Fiducia Supplicans has this statement, and here is another statement that was infallibly defined by the magisterium, and one clearly contradicts the other. I mean, someone might have said it, but for me, it was just
Hmm.
rash accusations, not an attempt to try to engage the document and to give it a charitable interpretation. In fact, the inability to give the document a charitable interpretation is seen by the fact that people keep refusing the document or refusing the clarifications of the document after both Pope and Cardinal Fernandez have been clarifying and clarifying continuously, but they don't care about the clarifications. They just want to discard the document altogether. No attempts to compromise, no attempts to try to see how things can be reconciled with their interpretation of orthodoxy. None. It's just try to discard it altogether because they stamped the label heresy on it, and that's not how it works at all.
Yeah, it seems like it was Cardinal Sarah who accused the Pope of teaching heresy in this document, Fiducia Supplicans, and he didn't really substantiate it sufficiently. So it's pretty odd. And the hermeneutic that they use seems to be the hermeneutic of suspicion and rupture, which is ironic because they're supposed to be big Benedict XVI guys, and Benedict was very noteworthy for teaching the hermeneutic of continuity, which it looks like they've abandoned. So that's unfortunate. Now let's talk about heresy disguised as tradition, as your book is titled. Can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe some examples that you've noticed where um, people have put forth something heretical but then claimed it's traditional?
Yeah. So. just to, I would like just to pick on something that you said about hermeneutic of continuity. I am a person who has been deeply influenced by Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. Some people might think that, oh, he's just saying this because he just loves Bergoglio and Pope Francis, and it's true, but it's not all of it. It was Pope Benedict who taught me to have a hermeneutic of continuity, of reforming continuity, which is the precise term that he used. So there is continuity, but there's also reform. So it's not static, but it's continuous. And what we see is people think that the hermeneutic of rupture is just the modernists, the liberals who say, oh, there's a rupture between the pre-Vatican II church, the post-Vatican II church, so we must follow what's new and discard what's old. That's a hermeneutic of rupture. But what those critics of the Pope, those traditionalists or conservative critics of the Pope are saying is also hermeneutic of rupture. They also believe that there's a rupture. The difference is that the liberals think that we should believe what came after the rupture, and the others believe that we should believe what came before the rupture. But it's still a hermeneutic of rupture. There's no attempt to bridge the supposed rupture with a continuity. And that brings me then to my book, Heresy Disguises Tradition. Yes, I believe that this book, I got an inspiration for this book uh, from my one of my first articles in Where Peter Is, Sola Traditio. And what I noticed is when I wrote that article is that just like the Protestants have this concept of sola scriptura, and in which we have only scripture, and then they judge the magisterium based on their personal interpretation of scripture. What I found is that the those who were attacking the Pope did the same, but with tradition. And we must remember that tradition and scripture are two modes of transmission of the same deposit of the faith. So if sola scriptura is incorrect, then sola traditio is also incorrect. If a personal interpretation of scripture cannot trump uh, the magisterium, then neither a personal interpretation tradition can trump the magisterium. And from that point onward, I tried to see if the same pattern would apply to other heresies, and that's what I found. If you peruse the history of the church, the history of heresies, um, we see that every single, not every single, I cannot make such a general statement, but I would I would think that almost all heresies believe that they are defending a certain kind of tradition against the magisterium of their day. They believe that they had a purer access to how the faith was practiced in earlier forms, even if it was how the faith was practiced during the times of Jesus or in the times of the apostolic church. And so the church, the modern church or the church of their day, had innovated, and that's how they viewed it. If you check Arius, Nestorius, all the Judaizers, they all thought that the church had innovated, and they were returning to a pure form of tradition. And that's what my book seeks to establish. Uh, I sweep the history of the church from the time of Jesus to the Second Vatican Council, and I noticed that most important heresies, the most famous heresies, they all fall victim to this pattern, that they believe that they were defending some kind of tradition against the magisterium of their day.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed. A lot of people seem to be in dissent against the magisterium, which is ironic because a lot of these same figures who are currently in dissent were the very ones who used to say, look to the Pope and look to the magisterium over and against the liberals and things like that. Whereas they've become just like their liberal counterparts insofar as they are dissenters. They're just dissenters from a more conservative or traditional perspective, but dissenters nonetheless. So it is pretty interesting that we've seen a shift there. And by the way, I thought it was helpful that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
mentioned there the
yeah.
magisterium as the one that puts tradition into perspective, because this is actually something that Paul VI addressed in relation to dissenters in his own day. Here's what he says. He says, quote, "It is even affirmed that the Second Vatican Council is not binding, that the faith would be in danger also because of the post-conciliar reforms and guidelines, which there is a duty to disobey to preserve certain traditions." What traditions? Does it belong to this group and not the Pope, not the Episcopal College, not an ecumenical council to establish which of the countless traditions must be regarded as the norm of faith? So, in other words, what he's saying is some people have made themselves their own magisterium, and they're the ones determining what is traditional. And it's very much like you said, similar to how the Protestants behave and approach these issues.
Mhm. Yes,
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, in fact, one of the chapters of my book is dedicated to the Protestant Reformation. So the parallels are there. And I also liked what you said that a few years ago, many of these critics of today were saying we have to rely on the Pope. We have to defend the Pope. And now they change. So just because of that, we know that they are not so traditional because they are picking and choosing the traditions that they follow. They might think that by going to a certain liturgy or by adhering to certain teachings that they are doing what they have always been doing. That's their premise. Or how can I be wrong if I'm doing what I've always been doing? Well, no, you're not doing what you've always been doing because a few years ago you were submitting to the Pope, and now you say that you are not submitting to the Pope, that you cannot submit to the Pope because of these other traditions. So there's a pick and choose. There's a pick and choose. So they are not doing what they have always been doing. They have to choose. Now, on my end, I don't need to choose. I can submit to the Pope and to every single doctrine of the Catholic Church, but that doctrine needs to be properly interpreted because there are such things as doctrinal development. There is such a thing as the Church uh, expressing the eternal truths in ways that the new cultures can understand, the aggiornamento. So how do we define how do we know which interpretation is correct? That's why we have an infallible or an authoritative interpreter. Doesn't need to be infallible all the time, but it's the authoritative interpreter. And that authoritative interpreter is the church. And the church is not saying discard tradition. No, just the church is only saying that we need to have a proper understanding of tradition, and that is currently lacking because many people's idea of tradition has been formed or misinformed by certain commentary websites and certain pundits who had a partial or simplistic or even erroneous idea of what tradition is.
But you know what some people are going to say? They're going to say, well, if it's not infallible, it could be heretical, and the Pope is teaching heresy. Therefore, I can't follow the Pope. You say that we need to follow the magisterium as the standard, but the magisterium is teaching heresy, they claim. What would you say in response to
Mhm. Well, that's precisely what my book is all about. Okay, so I would say this is my personal belief that the magisterium cannot, even the non infallible magisterium, cannot bind the faithful into error because the magisterium obliges the faithful to submit to it. So that I cannot reconcile this idea that the even the non-infallible statements of magisterium can bind the person into error. This does not mean that these non-infallible statements are free from deficiencies, that they are not connected with certain realities that are contingent, that they cannot be reformed. But I do not believe that the Pope can bind in a magisterial document the faithful into a heresy. But that's my opinion. Now, if we are going to address that statement, which we see in radical tradition circles, that if the Pope is teaching heresy, according to my personal interpretation, then I can just disregard it. And they will even quote certain saints in favor of this position. But that's exactly why I chose to write this book. First of all, those saints were talking about an heretical pope as a theoretical speculation. It's just like we nowadays have some theology about aliens, and we don't know if aliens exist or not. So it was very much theoretical speculation. Saint Bellarmine uh, wrote about what would happen if the Pope was a heretic or not, but he said, personally, I do not believe that this will is going ever to happen. So, but let's just take that for granted. And so there's this statement in radical traditional circles. If I interpret that the Pope is teaching heresy or that the Pope is teaching against tradition, I can disregard it. And what my book seeks to explore is very well what happened throughout the church history to every single person who used that justification to undermine the magisterium, to dissent from the magisterium. And what we see is that the odds are not very favorable. They believe that they have a fail-proof system here, but they're not. The amount of people who thought the same thing about the magisterium of their day and that ended up as heretics, that ended up condemned by the current doctrine of the church that we take for granted nowadays. It's astounding. It's much easier to, and this is obvious because we believe that the Pope enjoys divine assistance in the fulfillment of the whole of his office, the whole of his book of his munus. So we don't enjoy that divine assistance. So it's obvious that the odds are going to be against us. And when the radical traditions are placing their bets, they have a completely erroneous perspective of the odds that they are facing. And that's what my book is all about. The people who followed that premise to their logical conclusion, they did not end well. It's just like Professor Rocco Buttiglione wrote. He was a disciple of Pope St. John Paul II. He said that there are not many popes that people can say that were heretics, but every single heretic believed that the Pope of their time was a heretic. So I think that we have much more safety, much more security, and following magisterium and trying to charitably apply a hermeneutic of continuity, which is what I've been always been doing, and that's what people simply disregard as if it's Pope's planning or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, they tend to be dismissive of the hermeneutic and also theology behind what you're saying, and they just try to write it off as Pope's planning, which I find to be hilariously um, poor in an attempt to actually engage an intellectual position. Um, but be that as it may, what would you say to people who say, "But what about Honorius and Vigilius? Weren't they heretics?"
Well, and that's the final chapter of my book,
Mhm.
precisely because we're talking about the odds that each person must have, the odds that each person has by choosing each option. Of course, I had to address the objection that some popes have been heretics. And what I did was to gather information and to prove that these popes were not heretics, or at least they did not bind the church into heresy. And I'm doing this actually by following historians that until a few years ago, all the Catholic apologists would regard as credible. In fact, until a few years ago, all Catholic apologists were trying to um, debunk the heretical Pope's objection. So I did just that on the final chapter of the book, and I also tried, since nowadays we have a more developed perspective of what doctrine development is or what papal infallibility is. I try to use this knowledge that we have nowadays and apply it to those popes and show that according to the principles of donum veritatis, of lumen gentium, that the popes never bound the church into heresy if we understand their statements and their actions appropriately, and according to the manifest mind and will of those popes. Um, so I believe, of course, these cases are extremely complex. It needed a chapter, but I could say that it would need a whole book. But the those accusations do not fly, because if you followed the Pope of your day, for example, Honorius, let's take Honorius. He wrote a letter to Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, and that letter could be misconstrued as proclaiming the heresy of monothelitism. Well, even the people of their day, of Pope Honorius, they also knew that there was an orthodox interpretation for that letter, but it could be misconstrued as monothelitist. Okay, now when Patriarch Sergius tried to implement that letter, he could not find validation from the Pope of his time. Why? Because Honorius had died in the meantime, and the Pope that succeeded him did not validate that course of action. So everyone was always protected because there was an immediately living interpreter of that letter that said, no, that interpretation is incorrect. So if people had followed the Pope of their time, instead of following a dead letter from a dead Pope that could not interpret it anymore, ergo, a personal interpretation of tradition apart from the living magisterium, if people had just followed the Pope, the monothelitist heresy would not have spread so far. This actually reinforces what I'm saying. The church is credible because the church is living. There was a Pope at that time that was saying, don't go there. And everything that could be construed as heretical uh, came from interpreting a letter from a dead pope that could not clarify himself anymore, and they could that pope and that was already a tradition that was set apart from the living magisterium. The living magisterium was interpreting that tradition accordingly and accurately.
Yeah, very helpful. Now, I want to shift briefly to the issue of social media and also news. Let's talk about navigating the headlines. We see all sorts of things claimed about Pope Francis and the Catholic Church in the headlines. And oftentimes it seems like the headlines don't line up with the truth. And unfortunately, this is true not only of secular headlines, but also a lot of Catholic sources. Let's talk about how to navigate the headlines and the fact that there really is a problem here and that we need to know how to navigate the headlines and can't just necessarily trust them and take them at face value.
That's actually something that I learned from Benedict himself, because how did I became an apologist? It was because I noticed that I loved Benedict. I was reading Benedict all the time, and what I noticed was that the secular media was portraying him in a way that did not correspond to reality. So what I learned from Pope Benedict, from the media cabal against him, was not to follow the sensationalism of the media. Just wait for the dust to settle. Do not rush to comment on the controversies. Wait for the dust to settle. uh, Prefer to go to the primary sources, because nowadays we have the opportunity to consult those primary sources. These speeches, these documents are available for free in the Vatican website. And so when I did this, I noticed that 99% of the controversies could be easily solved. And now with Francis, it's the same thing. The only difference is that the Catholic media that and in during Benedict was uh, defending the Pope, now they are the ones who are promoting these controversies because they don't like the Pope, because that Pope challenges their presuppositions. The Pope should be only correcting the other guys, not us. We are the faithful Catholics, so now we have to try to comb every single statement from the Pope and try to spin it in the worst possible light. I actually say it in a very ironic way that it's interesting that they read the Pope, they put the Pope under the microscope, but not to understand him, but to find fault with him. If they had put so much enthusiasm in 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 examining everything that the Pope says and does, in order to understand and to convert and to become better Catholics, as they do to find fault with him, then the church would probably have already overcome this crisis of evangelization in the modern world. But no, nowadays what we have is people don't want to be corrected, and unfortunately the media nowadays, the Catholic media nowadays, exists to validate this subculture of people who believe ontologically that they are faithful, no matter how much the Pope says that they are in the wrong, that says that they need to correct their course.
Yeah, that's interesting, because Pope Francis has been addressing some of these critics extensively, and they seem to just completely ignore it, and it just they brush it right off, and it doesn't really impact them. Let's talk a little bit about some manufactured controversies in your observation. Are there instances where the critics have manufactured artificial controversies that, of course, didn't actually correspond to reality?
Yes, the most egregious case is the supposed Pachamama controversy. That
Yeah.
yeah, there no one at the time, neither the organizers of the event, neither the indigenous people were there. They never used the Pachamama term. They didn't. And then people are going to say, oh, the Pope said that it was Pachamama. Wrong, because the Pope immediately corrected, or the Vatican spokespeople immediately corrected, that the Pope had used the Pachamama term only as a reference to the statue, because that's how the statue came to be known. So instead of saying the statue that has been causing controversy, they said Pachamama because everyone was calling it Pachamama. They were referring to it. This was clarified 2 hours after. So no one used the Pachamama term, unless we are talking about after the term became well established in because of the controversy. Who used the Pachamama term? It was those who were attacking the Pope. They were the ones who said this looks pagan. There was some people from some news that said this looks like a certain pagan ritual from the native indigenous peoples, and it just took off from there. And they didn't even try to understand what the term Pachamama is, that it might mean many things, that it might not be pagan or not, or whether it was Pachamama itself. And the thing that's interesting is this: the thing that I did when I noticed this controversy was to again go to the primary sources, check the whole video, and what I saw in the video was that one of the native one of the native indigenous women who were there, when presented the statue to the Pope, they said, and we can still hear that in that YouTube video. Is you just need to go there. Nuestra Señora de la Amazonia, Our Lady of the Amazon. It's there. Afterwards, the spokespeople said, no, this statue does not have Marian interpretations. And probably because the statue was not acquired for that purpose. This was something that the people there projected onto the image without the image being that. But that's the sense in which they performed that ceremony. And it's interesting that the spokespeople say it's not Marian and it's not pagan. And what do these media, Catholic media, say? Oh, the spokespeople said it's not Marian, therefore it's pagan. So you agree with the spokespeople when they say that it's not Marian, but you don't agree when they say it's not pagan. It's in the same sentence. So if you are going to disregard the one of the explanations, might disregard the one that says that it's not Marian because the indigenous people clearly said Our Lady of the Amazon. Or when the Pope says the Pachamama statues who which did not have pagan connotations were retrieved. What did they hear? Oh, the Pope called it Pachamama. And the sentence right after that says they did not have pagan connotations is ignored. They pick what they want and they ignore the rest. This is I don't know how to say it. I don't want to impute dishonesty to people, but this is so egregious that this controversy should not have existed at all. It could have been clarified quickly. And it ended up with people breaking into a church and stealing an object, vandalizing it, and everyone is very happy with it. And like if we are Catholics, we don't think that the ends justify the means, but here we are. And hopefully it did. It's a good thing that it did not go into other extremes. It's completely outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a video not long ago where I did my best to kind of demonstrate the progression of how people reported on this event and how there was a lot of discontinuity between what they reported and what the truth actually is. So maybe y'all go and check that out if you want to see more about the Pachamama issue. Yeah, that's a really good example. And again, I think Fiducia Supplicans is another instance of a manufactured controversy because we had seen for several months fake headlines saying that the Pope is going to approve of blessing gay unions. And so, whenever this document came out, people didn't actually read it and they just saw certain headlines and they saw a few words in the document, misunderstood them, didn't take things by how the document explains them, but just kind of ripped them out of context and imported their own meaning into these things and assumed the worst. And all that preparation work that had been done for months telling people the Pope is going to do this Well, whenever people saw these headlines, they didn't bother to really look into it, and so they just embraced this fake news, and so they were kind of set up to believe this well in advance. And a lot of people bought into it, still believe, the fake news in this area. So I think that's another example of manufactured controversy, and I've just seen this non-stop in this pontificate. um and it's truly sad because a lot of times it comes from Catholics. I expect it to come from the secular world. I expect the world to do godless things. It's a different thing for a Catholic to engage in this kind of sinful behavior. um and so, yeah, that is tragic. And again, I think the Pachamama issue is probably the best instance of that. Let's talk a little bit about balancing tradition and innovation. We've seen Pope Francis talk about innovation. We even saw Fiducia Supplicans use the word innovation. And so, sometimes when people hear innovation, they assume the worst, and they think that that is somehow opposed to tradition. And so if anybody speaks of innovation, they're somehow rejecting sacred tradition. Can you walk us through that?
So that's a good point. In in my book, so I do not merely peruse the history of the church and all the heresies and try to show how they all believed all those heresies was disguised as tradition. No, I actually have an introductory section in which I show that heresies are disguised as tradition because tradition sometimes is confused with innovation. If tradition could not be confused with innovation, then heresies would not disguise themselves as tradition. And I show how tradition sometimes seems like it's innovating, and in a sense it's innovating, but not in the sense that they are talking about, because the sense that they are talking about is rejecting eternal truths that never change. And that kind of innovation is out of bounds. But there are ways in which the tradition seems to be innovating and is innovating, namely, but we need to have nuanced distinctions at play. There's the concept of doctrinal development. We know that doctrine develops, yes, always in the same sense and in the same meaning, but sometimes this continuity, this preservation of type, as St. Cardinal Newman mentions, sometimes this has great outward variation. And St. Cardinal Newman uses metaphor of a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly. And uh, we might think, no, this caterpillar and this butterfly are not the same because who can compare them? They are completely different animals. But no, they are the same individual. There is a continuity, there is a preservation of type. It is the same animal, but it changed exteriorly drastically. So that's the point. That's that's one of the ways, doctrinal development, but with great outer variation. There's also the aggiornamento, in which that we have to differentiate between tradition and traditions. The one thing is the deposit, immutable deposit of the faith that Jesus relayed to us and the Holy Spirit relayed to the apostles and they relate to us. That cannot change. But another thing is how these eternal truths are expressed to the culture and to the age and to the geographical location of that time, because we are not angels. We always perceive everything, including these eternal truths, according to our own culture and to our own understanding. the way I experience or express the faith is different from the way another Portuguese person would express the faith 200 years ago, and it's different from the way an American or a Filipino might express their faith. It's the same faith, but we are different, and so the expressions of the faith are different. And sometimes when the church is trying to adjust the language, the way the tradition is expressed, so that it can say something to the cultures that are emerging, and which these radical traditions just disregard because, oh, they're liberals and progressives, there's nothing good in those cultures. But the thing is, those cultures are emerging, and we have to express our faith in ways that they can understand. So it's the same faith, but the tradition is dynamic. The way it is expressed might change, and this was a reality even on during the before the Second Vatican Council. I quote Pius X, Benedict XV. They all knew that this process existed, probably popes prior to them also. So that's another thing. And I also mention ressourcement, which is when theologians of today or magisterial agents of today go back to traditions from dating from many centuries ago, but which have been forgotten, but they are still traditions. But since they were forgotten by introducing them, some people might think, oh, this is a novelty, but it's not. It's something traditional. We are simply confusing the way we live tradition today with the only possible tradition that exists, which is not. So there are many mechanisms through which tradition might seem like an innovation, but it's not. At least it's not an innovation in the bad sense of the word, in the modernist sense of the word, or in the heretical sense of the word.
What would you say about people who approach the question of tradition by kind of stopping at a particular point, stopping the process of tradition and saying, okay, from this part, no further, and then cutting off the present from tradition? What would you say to those people?
Yes, that's also one of the things that I mentioned in the book. A proper understanding of tradition does not merely focus on the past. Yes, it has the past in it understands the past and knows that the past is important. But, and this is something that Joseph Ratzinger said in a book of his, tradition can only look to the past because it looks to the future. If there was no future, there would not be a need for tradition. Why would we need to pass on our knowledge or pass on our faith if there is no future? There would not be a need for that. It would be paradoxical. So tradition is connecting the past and the future. And what is the link that makes this connection? It's the present. So it's not, tradition is not something from the past that we just go and leave the present here and we go back to the past. No, tradition is happening right now. It is a living process. And if you cut the present, if you cut the link that exists in the present, you are disassociating the past from the future. And in that sense, what you're doing is killing the process of tradition. The tradition is not just everything that happened in the past, it's the process that is happening right now. And Pope Francis uses the metaphor of a tree. A tree contains roots, yes, and without the roots, the tree dies, shrivels, and dies. But the tree is not just the roots, the tree is the trunk, the tree is the branches, the tree is the fruits and the flowers. So if you think, no, I look at the roots, and these roots, objectively, in terms of shape, in terms of function, they do not have anything to do with the branches or with the leaves or with the flower. Then you will just cut off the tree and leave a stump, because roots without the trunk, without the leaves, without the branches, it's a dead stump. So you kill the tree. The tree is alive, and it's in the process of living, of growing right now, because it has roots. But the roots exist to feed the tree, not to give a pretext to cut it down.
Yeah. Now, before we end here, I wanted to ask you two things. Number one, somebody in the chat was asking about your cover for the book, which you can kind of see in the corner there. They were
I
asking
have
what
it.
it was.
I have
Yeah,
it here.
yeah. Can you explain
This
the
is the
meaning
Portuguese
behind it?
version, but yeah. So, if you see, when I was browsing the internet, I came across uh, a painting from, a part of a painting from Hieronymus Bosch, which is a painter which I like very much. And I thought, well, this is very interesting because it really shows what the book is all about. Of course, it's very hard to find a cover for Heresy disguised as tradition, because we're talking about abstract terms. It would be hard to find a cover either way. But this kind of shows what it is. So, because you see, there's this house that has the facade of an old woman, like it's tradition, okay? But you see that the house is hollow, and the house here is a young woman. Like there's an innovation right here in the hollowness of this facade that is tradition. So I thought, well, this is the heresy disguised as tradition. There's also some demons around, so I thought it was interesting. It's a way to an abstract way painting to convey an abstract meaning.
Yeah, that's pretty creative. I like that. That makes sense. All right, so last thing, was
Absolutely.
there anything else from the book that you wanted to cover that we didn't touch on that you think would be really important for the audience to know?
I think we got the general lines. So the book has a first section that says how tradition is confused with innovation. There's a middle section that shows precisely how the heresies of the past were disguised as tradition, and the third section is to show uh, how we can, in the middle of so many competing interpretations, find the true, correct interpretation, which is through the magisterium. And that's the book. Of course, there's lots of research here, lots of nuances, and lots of very fun facts that only after I dug on these things, they came up, and I thought, wow, this is very interesting. I didn't even need to, dig very deeply. They are there, but we have to have this pattern in mind. How many times tradition was confused with innovation, and how many times heresy was confused with tradition. So it was a very, very fun book to write. It's certainly my favorite apologetics book until now. Of course, I also have the Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, which we talked about in a different video, which I also enjoy a lot. And there's other books that I am also writing, but this one was really, really fun, and I hope that people also enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
And tell them where's the best place to get it, and also put in a plug for anything else you want to make the audience aware of.
The best place to get it is on Amazon.
Mhm.
There's an English version, which is the first one, and there's a Portuguese version where I also took some time to translate it.
Hmm.
But both of them, it's in Amazon. Amazon.com, search Heresy Disguised as Tradition, from Pedro Gabriel and En Route Media and Books. If you want the Portuguese version, I would suggest, if you're from Brazil, amazon.com.br. If you're from Portugal, amazon.es, which is the Spanish Amazon, and just get it. That's the best place to get it.
Cool. Yeah.
And I can
Yeah.
provide the link. I can provide all these links if you want, so that it can be in the video.
Yeah, that'd be great. I do have a link to the English one. I don't have the Portuguese. So if you can send that to me, I'll add it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Certainly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was incredibly helpful and fascinating. You're always welcome to come back on. I'd love to have you back on sometime.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for having me.
Is the audiobook coming?
I am searching for ways to put that in place.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Somebody was just asking, and I was curious about that too. Okay, we'll see. Well,
Yes,
again,
there are
thank you.
some people requesting it. I haven't done an audiobook before, so
Maybe you
I
can do
still
it.
have to study it. But
Yeah.
yeah, whenever I can, yes, I'll try.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for coming on. And everybody hit that like button and subscribe button. Of course, go check out the book, Amazon.com. Got a link to it there in the show notes. All right. We'll see you later. God bless. Hey, friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com.